Greetings, students. Welcome to Module 6. This one is a very exciting one for me because it contains one of my favorite theories, and that is the feminist theory. So we are in spring 2013, and it's much more springy now than it was when we started class. But we are into postmodern and social constructivist theories. Following the objectives of study that are in the syllabus, objective number 4, we're going to have the founders, the key concepts, the assumptions, some techniques, the role of the counselor, and of course the multicultural considerations of postmodern and social constructivist theories. First thing I'm going to go over with you is what's in D2L. Of course, there is this introductory video PowerPoint and the introductory video. There's a PowerPoint on all 3 of the theories that we're going to study during this module. And there's a couple of course reserves. Now, we haven't done course reserves since the second module, so I hope you remember how to find your course reserves. And the ones that you're going to look for for this module are in eMedia. I'm sorry, that's the video. The videos are in eMedia. The course reserves are in the Charles Sherrod Library under course reserves. And when you put in instructor name, just put my last name, and it should come right up for you. The first course reserve is a reading from Worrell and Rimmer from a book called Feminist Perspectives in Therapy, Empowering Diverse Women. And the first part that you'll be reading is a section that all the groups will be reading. And then the rest of that course reserve only will be assigned to certain groups. You can read the whole thing if you want to, but you'll only have to read what's assigned to your group. So pay special attention in the discussion area and in the directions for study as to what portion of that course reserve you're supposed to actually read. The second thing that's in course reserve has to do with the second assignment that is due April 13th, and we'll talk about that in just a few minutes, but it is from the New Krug book, and it's Appendix C. It talks about all the different theories and gives you a chance to take a little assessment to determine which theory probably fits you best. So that should be some fun in assignment 2. Then, of course, there is a video of the solution-focused brief therapy that you'll be watching, and you'll watch different portions of that according to your group as well. And I think that'll be some fun for you as well. After the directions for study, and after you've gone through the D2L content, you can check on the administrative notes here for this module. And there's a course reserve access in case you've forgotten how to get to that. The directions are in Module 1. And the video access also is in your study directions. You can find specific instructions how to get to the video, the solution-focused brief therapy video. Let's talk about your discussion area. It's just a little bit different in this module. Your initial post is due on Wednesday, March 31st, and the requirements are going to be a little different in this area this time. The requirement will be that you have to do a post on each of the 3 therapies, at least one post on each of the 3 therapies, feminist, narrative, and solution-focused brief therapy, in the discussion area in order to reach, the full maximum of points in that discussion area. The Module 6 assessment will be available to you on April the 12th and 13th, and it is 18 multiple choice and 2 true false, a relatively easy test, I think you'll find. And let's talk about the assignment 2 just a second. While we're in this module, you will need to be getting ready to turn into the Dropbox the assignment 2, which is due on Saturday, April 13th. And it is your results. Look at your rubric so you'll know exactly what to do, what to turn into the Dropbox. But it'll be your results of your assessment on what therapy fits best with you, and that's out of New Krug's Appendix C. Let's go to some highlights of this module, and I'll spend a little bit of time with you on the highlights that we're going to have for all 3 of these theories. But first, let's talk about postmodern. I mean, what really is postmodern? Basically, if you think about all of the changes that we went through in the 1960s, all the social constructs that certainly became different after the Civil Rights Movement, there's a lot associated with the postmodern therapies in those movements. And I think the biggest thing, honestly, is in postmodern, there's a huge importance placed around context. That is, who we are in context, in our environment, in our social setting, what our cultural beliefs and roles have given us to think we're supposed to be. So that is a big difference. But in the PowerPoint, there are several differences. And I know in the assessment as well, there's questions about those differences between postmodern and modern. When I think of modern, I think of behavioral, for instance, and B.F. Skinner, and all of the empirical evidence, the scientific model, and that sort of thing, which really doesn't even look at the context of the person. So that's what I think of when I think of modern. When I think of postmodern, I think truly of social context and the person in context in their environment. So the first one we're going to go over is feminist therapy. Now, the key phrase that you'll remember from feminist therapy is the personal is political, and I'll go over an explanation of that in just a second. The course reserve that you're going to be reading has 4 principles of feminist empowerment theory. That's empowerment feminist theory, EFT, that Worrell and Rimmer came up with. And the first one is that personal and social identities are interdependent. Personal, the person, and social, the context, identities are interdependent. In other words, what happens in one happens with the other. So that's where you come up with the idea that the personal is also political, because our social construct, our social environment has so many institutionalized biases, so many seats of privilege, that if you're not in that dominant group, you don't have that privilege. And that's really what came to the forefront when you look at feminist therapy. The third principle of EFT is that relationships in counseling are egalitarian, in counseling and outside of counseling. In other words, we're all equal. And we don't, as a feminist counselor, look to the client as I know more than she or he does. It's the client is the expert in their life. And the fourth principle is that women's perspectives are valued. One of the goals of feminist therapy, whether the client is a man or a woman, is that the voice of that person is valued. And self-esteem is a real goal in most feminist therapist settings. One thing about feminist therapy, if you look back to what we've studied, the psychoanalytical theories are about the individual, looked at the individual, but it didn't really include the social context of the individual. This is where that's added. And something that I would want you to remember about all the postmodern theories is that you can take all of these, we're just going to study 3 of them, but you can take all of the postmodern theories and actually apply the principles of it to techniques that we have learned in Gestalt, that we learned in person-centered, that we've learned even in existential and psychoanalytical. So really, these are a set of ideals and ideas about therapy that can be integrated and used with other techniques and other therapies. The feminist therapy is the one that is most connected to multicultural approaches. So it is the most highly sought after, or the strongest theory when it comes to multicultural considerations. That's feminist therapy. One reason is because one of the principles is that diversity is actually valued. There's a value placed in non-dominant groups. It challenges the male, heterosexual, able-bodied, youth-oriented ideas of culture. And we certainly have that in our culture. But in feminist therapy, those things are really challenged, and questions about how that fits into the client's life are germane to the counseling conversation. And so just to add a little bit more about the personal is political, which is that key phrase in feminist therapy. If we hope to bring about change in an individual, it follows that we must also bring about change in the context of that individual, social change. So you will find most feminist therapists very active in challenging and in making the social constructs for non-dominant groups better. So there are organizations that feminist therapists will belong to that challenge those constructs and that improve the lives of homosexuals, that improve the lives of the non-abled or the disabled person or the elderly. So you find activism in feminism as well. And it's not just about women. I think that's really, really an important thing that I would want you to remember here. There are men feminist therapists. It's a set of principles more than anything else. There are also men who are on the margins of our social constructs. Men of color, for instance, most of the time would be on the margins. And their voices are valued. So it's not just a woman thing, this feminist principles of feminist therapy. Adler, who is also one of my favorites, sort of democratized therapy. He looked at relationships between the counselor. He moved away from Freud's idea of the counselor being the expert. So he democratized, I'll use that word, counseling somewhat, in that he saw the counselor as in an equal role to the client in terms of the perspectives of counseling. Now, a feminist therapist would even go so far as to explain to a client, this is the process we're going to go through in therapy. So the client completely understands and that the counselor is not such an authority in the process. And in feminist therapy, there's also a little more sharing of the counselor to the client. Now, that is never done overboard, because you don't want to get into countertransference and in the session spending more time about the counselor than you do about the client. But there is more sharing of the client's ideas about social context and so forth than there is in other therapies. So with that look of privilege, and with the look of all types of oppression, not only oppression against women, but oppression against gays and lesbians, oppression against people of color, all of those less dominant or non-dominant groups, there's there's a recognition of that, and a look at the privilege of the dominant and how that affects our everyday lives. So that's deconstructed somewhat in feminist therapy. And the fact that, our society has encouraged both groups, the non-dominant and the dominant, to stick to some rigid roles. That men, for instance, are perceived as a breadwinner or are perceived as someone who doesn't have an equal responsibility for chores at home or parenting and that sort of thing. And that is changing, but still exists in most of our society. So a couple of techniques that might be used in feminist therapy would be a gender role analysis in the person's context, and also a power analysis, not just gender, but power. Who has the power? What power does the client have, and how does that affect the relationships of the client? So the feminist counselor would have several different roles in counseling. There would be an advocate. There might be a mentor. The counselor might be a coach, but also an activist with the social issues of a client. So a couple of the goals that would be set in feminist therapy would be a balance of power, a balance of gender equality or gender roles, and an interdependence balanced with independence. Another principle or goal would be empowerment, empowering the client with self-agency to assert and speak for him or herself. And, the last thing would be then to value and affirm the diversity, the difference that the client brings. And the next theory I want to talk about, spend just a little bit of time on, is narrative therapy. Michael White is certainly associated more than any other person with narrative therapy. And his basis is that we pick up problem-saturated stories and from our context. There comes that postmodern context again. We pick up these problem-saturated stories from our context, and we get wedded to those, and we can't let go of them. They are so much a part of who we are that we can't detach from them. So a narrative therapist would take that and externalize the problem, take the problem out of the individual. In fact, the key phrase in narrative therapy is, the person is not the problem. The problem is the problem. And so that approaches that externalization of the problem from the person. And you look for dominant themes in the context of a person that would actually bring their stories that are problem saturated and let the client see, well, that's where that comes from. It's not me. And they might add, the real technique of narrative is questions. It's almost Socratic in nature. Can you remember a time when this problem didn't dominate your life? That's a good question in narrative therapy. So you begin to talk about the strengths. So narrative therapists are going to go for the strengths of a client and pull them out. And one last thing I would mention about narrative therapy is I like this a lot, although it's very time-consuming. A narrative therapist might sit down and write a letter to the client in between sessions and say, this is what I saw, and let the client look at that. And the next session, you might talk about what the therapist saw and what the client felt and what the understanding was and so forth. Now, if the therapist finds that too entirely time-consuming, which once you do your notes and you do the session and all that stuff, it gets pretty time-consuming. So at least I think a narrative therapist would, at the end of counseling, when it winds down, you come to the termination point in counseling, the narrative therapist would sit down and write a letter and say, this is what I believe we actually achieved. And let's talk about that in the last session, and let's look at it, and so we can close out with that. So it brings therapy to a really nice, concrete, tie it up with in a nice little bow kind of situation. So, and with narrative as well, you can use those techniques and integrate that with any other kind of therapy, Gestalt, behavioral even, certainly cognitive behavioral, any of those. And the last mode of therapy that we study in Module 6 is solution-focused brief therapy, associated with ETSU Kimberg and Steve DeShazer. There's a couple other founders that are associated with it as well, but this is probably today one of the two most popular modes used. I would say cognitive behavioral maybe is right up there along with it, but it is solution-focused, has been empirically proven. There's a lot of evidence out there on it. And it's really kind of an effective breath of fresh air when you come to think about it in therapy. It is very effective, and because it doesn't look into the past, it has no reference to the past whatsoever. So wow, what a change! How far we've come from Freud, right? And it would look at a client's strengths, not their liabilities. It would look at a client's competencies, not their deficits, and also at their assets, not necessarily their problems. So it is not a problem-saturated therapy. The emphasis is on change. And you actually, as a solution-focused brief therapist, look for exceptions to any issue that the client might be bringing. You look for those exceptions. And you might even say, well, from the time you made the appointment, this is called pre-session change in therapy, in solution-focused therapy. From the time you made the appointment, you called to make the appointment, how has this issue for you improved? And you know what? Most of the time, since that step of calling to make the appointment has been made, the client will have worked through some things about the presenting issue. It's amazing. So you have that conversation right up front. Well, how did you make that change? Well, could we apply that a little more or in a different place or however? So there's talk about scaling as well. Well, on a scale of 1 to 10, where were you with this problem yesterday or before you made the call to get the appointment? And where are you now? And where would you like to get to? So it's very goal-oriented. And the thing you remember about solution-focused, while in feminist you remember the personal is political, and in narrative you remember the problem, the person's not the problem is the problem. In solution-focused, what you remember is the miracle question. Now, the miracle question, as you'll see in the video that you're going to watch, goes like this. Let's say that tomorrow morning you woke up and this problem you're bringing me today has completely disappeared. So, if it's completely disappeared, how would that be for you? What would that be like? And you begin to get the client to actually place themselves into not having that problem, and they begin to tell you how it would be. And then you can begin to talk about getting there, and that would be the goal of therapy. So, you know what? This, might sound really like a breath of fresh air, but I don't know if we specifically studied it, but Adler, remember Adler, had this technique that he called acting as if. That's what he called it, acting as if. I think that's what we have here in solution-focused. It's acting as if. It's, if this were really not a problem, then how would your life be? I mean, what would be different for you? Okay, how could that possibly happen for that to be different for you? So it also, reminds me a little bit of, remember William Glasser and reality therapy? Remember his ideal world of the client? There it is too. So I think what Insoo Kim Berg and Steve DeShazer have done is just studied their predecessors and put some new language on this thing. And it's called solution-focused brief therapy. So next we're going to talk about the strengths and shortcomings of postmodern social constructivist psychotherapeutic theories. And the first thing is we're seeing more and more of a strength in therapy when it comes to multicultural and non-dominant groups. And the whole social constructivist theory, the whole the whole movement is totally congruent with the philosophy of multiculturalism because it values diversity in feminism, for instance, okay? And it also looks at the context of the person, not just how we think the person ought to be or if it fits some kind of scientific model. But of all of the theories that postmodern brings to us, the feminist theoretical approach has the most in common with multicultural aspects and with social justice perspectives as well. So, I guess there would be some shortcomings of this. There are some clients who want to hold to beliefs that are applied to them by the culture. They don't want the freedom to pursue a career outside the home, for instance, or have a right to education. And so therapists must be aware of those values in the client, and that's something that you would find out right up front. And, some clients may come to a counselor and say, well, I'm here because you really are the expert, so I'm asking you, and then you get into that trouble area of giving advice, which you should never go into from my point of view. So there you have it. We've talked about founders, some of the basic assumptions. In your PowerPoint presentation, there's a lot more information. And remember that every time you see an asterisk, you should look for the notes to the PowerPoint and know what the primary techniques and role of the counselor are before you take the assessment, and also understand those multicultural considerations. So thanks, and have fun with Module 6.